At this time, I am really excited to introduce Dr. Michaela O'Donnell. She is going to share 4 practical theological questions to use in any classroom. And so, Dr. Michaela O'Donnell is the Mary and Dale Andringa, I hope I'm saying that correct, Michaela, Executive Director, Chair at the Max De Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary, and is also an Assistant Professor of Marketplace Leadership. She leads Fuller's Doctor of Global Leadership, Redemptive Imagination in the Marketplace program, and is the author of Make Work Matter, one of my favorite books, and also co-author of Life in Flux. Michaela, welcome.
Oh, thank you for the very generous introduction, Jen. I'm glad to be here today. It was wonderful to listen to you, Dr. Tolley, just to hear some of your big framing thoughts. But yeah, I'm a big fan of what's happening at the center as well. I think maybe all the people are going to line up and say that. And so to get to be part of this event is a real treat. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen and we can jump in. Okay, it's working so far. Let's get to presenter mode. Okay, so like Jen said, I come from Fuller Seminary, which is an interesting place. The seminary is an interesting place to be having these kinds of conversations about faith and entrepreneurship. They happen in some really explicit ways, and then they happen, we don't have a business school, so they happen in other nuanced ways, just in a variety of moments and opportunities. And the big thing I want to do today is I want to introduce you to 4 practical theology questions that are deeply meaningful, deeply provocative, very entrepreneurial, and also broadly accessible. You could have, I've used them with Fortune 500 clients that don't have any care that I'm a Christian person or a practical theologian. I've used them with students who are training to become pastors, and they care very deeply about the theological orientation. And we use them in a program that I'm going to tell you about that Jen mentioned, our Doctor of Global Leadership. But just as sort of by way of context first, so I'm the executive director of the Max De Pree Center for Leadership. Max De Pree was a longtime CEO of Herman Miller, now Miller Knoll office furniture company. If you've ever sat in or appreciated an Eames chair, this is the company that made those in West Michigan. And really out of that legacy and out of Max's Christian faith, here at the De Pree Center, we imagine a world in which Christian leaders across industries and seasons of life are deeply formed as disciples of Jesus so that they can wisely seek the very best for the people and systems entrusted to their care. If you are in the business of forming people who are going to be entrepreneurs or forming business students to think entrepreneurially, you are in the business of forming leaders, just like we are. And we think that there is no better leadership development strategy than the story of Jesus. And again, we get to do that in a really explicit way at Fuller Seminary. And for us, the interesting thing is to be integrating the business aspect of it. We reach about 50,000 people a year through various lifelong learning activities, whether it's a podcast that someone's tuning into or a daily biblical devotion that someone's reading, a temporary or short-term vocational discernment cohort. We reach a lot of people. And about 4 or 5 years ago, at Fuller, our Office of Professional Doctoral Work, if you are familiar with the seminary context, these would be the folks that would run our Doctor of Ministry. They came to me and they said, "Hey, Michaela, you like to start new things. You're kind of an entrepreneur. How would you like to start a brand new degree?" I was like, "Oh, I'm really busy. I'm starting lots of things at the center. Those entrepreneurial muscles are itched." And they said, "We just really feel like there's a market for advanced studies in theology for people who do not have masters in theology." I was like, "Ooh, that's interesting. You mean like people with MBAs and with JDs and educational degrees?" And they said yes. And so I was given the charge to see if we could come up with a Doctor of Global Leadership that would meet the needs of these particular students. We are in year 3 of our first cohort. It's a 4-year program and are launching our next one next year. I've been learning lots of things, lots of mistakes, lots of, whatevers. But at the core of the degree, we've decided to build it around these 4 practical theology questions because of how versatile they are. One thing that's interesting to note about this program is even more than teaching people what to think theologically, we're in the business of teaching them how to think theologically about their leadership context. And that differentiator makes this framework quite interesting. Now, practical theology, sometimes people are like, what is that? What words are you saying? What do you mean by that? It's a discipline. It's a formal discipline. Sometimes, a lot of times people say, shouldn't all theology be practical? And I say, yes. And, we all have sort of different roles in that. If you think about theology and the different theological disciplines, whether it's biblical theology, systematic theology, practical theology, really it's about starting points. So the biblical theologians are always going to start with the text, wonderfully so, and say what's going on in the text. Systematic theologians are going to talk about the big sweeping doctrines and paradigms and how we map those onto life in the service of the church. Practical theologians, our starting question is, what's going on in the world? What's going on in the world, and what does the Bible and Christian tradition and theology have to say in light of that? Now, really clearly and explicitly connecting this to entrepreneurship. I come from a family of entrepreneurs. Sometimes I feel like an entrepreneur who ended up in the academy. It's an interesting thing. So I don't have a business degree. I have theological degrees, but that's sort of the family DNA there. And in one of the books that I wrote that Jen mentioned called Make Work Matter, which was actually the fruit of some dissertation research I did with Christian entrepreneurs, after listening to them talk, I decided to define entrepreneurship this way. It's the task of noticing gaps, and then in the face of risk, stewarding resources to fill those gaps in meaningful ways. Okay. Noticing gaps, and in the face of risk, stewarding resources to fill those gaps in meaningful ways. And we know that happens when people start formal business creation, and then in lots of informal ways as well. Let's see here. So then these questions are actually questions that help us notice the gaps, align with God, take risks, and then steward resources to fill those gaps in meaningful ways. So I will run through them now. And sometimes people say, is this kind of a discernment method? And I'm like, yes, it's a discernment method. It's a method that when you stack these 4 questions together, helps you notice problems and name them together, right? And do some of the change work that Dr. Tolley was referencing, some of the innovation work that we heard about earlier. This is it. Some of the biggest barriers to getting going on that change work are the move from 0 to 1, the move from stuck to unstuck. And this is a method that can help do that. So the first, so I've written here, think theologically, act entrepreneurially. The first question is, what is going on? This is a simplified version of 30 to 40 years of practical theology methodology, where lots of different scholars have very in-depth methods about how to move communities of people through action and reflection and into discernment. If you get really curious and you think, I want to know more about this discipline of practical theology, and I want the meat behind what, and I'm giving a high level overview. If you want the meat behind what I'm talking about, I think Richard Osmer's book, Practical Theology and Introduction, is really the best book that's out here. And if you do go and read that book, you'll notice these questions are key movements in his work as well. So what is going on? That's the first question. And we invite students in our program to offer what we call a very thick description here. And they'll end up writing a chapter about each of the questions that I'm posing here. But it can also be on a much more abbreviated level. So let me give you just a couple of examples of what we mean by answering the question, what is going on? So one of my students, she's a healthcare administrator, and she's in HR. And she noticed after they did like sort of year-end reporting on a bunch of different data sets, that there was a particular population group in her healthcare system that was being terminated at 2.5 times the rate of any other population group. And for her, that's a theological question, right? That right there is a what is going on, and her ability to name that. I'll give you another example. It was actually the work I did back in 2016, 2017, when I was doing my doctoral work. This is when the gig economy was rising, and it was after the '08 housing crisis. And I had a lot of peers in their 20s and 30s who were all of a sudden taking on gig work. So my number one was gig work is on the rise, 40% higher than it used to be, right? You're getting down to an observation of what's going on. If I ask my fourth grader this kind of question, I'd be like, what's going on? She said, Mom, there's too much trash on campus. Okay. There's too much trash on her elementary school campus. You can do this on a bunch of different levels. The second one, why is it going on? This is actually kind of a hard move. This question from practical theologians is about tapping into the big stories that are at play in our culture, in our multicultural environment, our global environment, local environment. So let me walk those three examples out with this. Why is it going on? So in the first example, the healthcare administrator, she would say, okay, there's actually been a fair amount of bias that she can trace, right? She can see some of that in employee evaluations. Also, one of the things that she realized when she looked into this further is that one of the big reasons why this was happening was because this population group was taking public transit into work. And when public transit was late, that would go as a tardy on their records. And 1, 2, 3, then you're terminated. So that kind of like, why is this happening? In the project I told you about, when gig work is on the rise, or still is, but especially when we were first seeing that uptick 8 or 9 years ago, we had the housing crisis, we had economic, we had the shift in burden of responsibility from institutions to individuals and how that came into being. We had globalization and information distribution, just all of those things were behind why there were more gig workers, both positively and negatively. If you ask my fourth grader, why is there so much trash on campus? She would say, people aren't holding up to the core values of responsibility at this school. She might also say, there's not enough trash cans here. And so she's starting to notice the gaps. We're starting to notice the why. Okay, so what's going on? Why is it going on? The third movement here, what ought to be going on, this is all of these questions are theological. They're all questions that we ask with our Christian framework at play. But this is the most explicitly biblical and theological move in terms of an outsider coming in using this kind of framework. This is the what ought to be going on. As people, as Dr. Tolley was saying, as people who our imagination is shaped by the story of Christ, we think that redemption ought to be happening. We think that human flourishing is a big deal. We think that restoration is at play. We think that God is at move. And as we start to see ask and notice these what ought to be going on questions, we start to see how we might be part of filling those gaps and stewarding resources in meaningful ways. So again, to walk out those three examples, in the first, the healthcare system, this person is developing a portrait of human flourishing based on Romans 14, right? Like, people are made in the image of God. They ought to be flourishing. In the example that I gave from doctoral work, the gig economy, I actually argued that the church ought to be forming people more entrepreneurially. And so I went and talked to all these Christian entrepreneurs. I'm like, how did you make your way in an unstable economy? Put together what they said and came up with some patterns and developed a model out of that. For my fourth grader, what ought to be going on? Well, we should keep this place beautiful, right? That's a deeply theological ideal and truth, right? We should keep creation beautiful. And then finally, how do we move forward? This is where you get really strategic and pragmatic. All four of these questions are questions that you could ask, really included in many different kinds of lessons and different types of curriculum and subjects that you're teaching. They teach people, students, adults, young people, emerging adults, to move between action and reflection, to notice gaps, to imagine how they would get very practical and move toward very realistic solutions. So let me just conclude by telling you each of those examples, how number 4 plays out or played out. So in the healthcare system, there's these actual interventions that are happening now in that company, and they have to do with tardiness and public transit, and they have seen a change in that stat of that particular population group being terminated at a higher rate than others. In the work that I did as a doctoral student, I took those patterns that came up and we created a method at the De Pree Center, and we've run 100 of those cohorts in the last 5 years, teaching more people to be more vocationally discerning and entrepreneurial. And then finally, on the fourth grade level, and the very, very tangible, all the way down at the ground level, she wrote a petition to her principal, and the principal said, okay, why don't you run a fundraiser? And if you can raise X number of dollars, we'll put in more trash cans around campus. They did that. That was successful. And so you can see how each of these moves starts to generate the possibility for both imagination and practical action. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michaela. I really love those questions because they can be used in any classroom. And so here's a question for you. How do you curate a welcoming and inclusive response to these questions in universities where there is a deeply pluralistic classrooms in at the university? How do you curate that environment?
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful question. I would say that these naturally create a space for multi perspective, even multi-value conversations. It does mean that you'll do the hard work, particularly in that step three of the what ought to be happening, of getting at some of that deeper value stuff. If you're in a secular university, you may not say, well, let's come in with the Christian imagination of redemption, but it might say, well, what do we want for our people as a society? And how do we get there in our own value system? So I actually think they cut across differences quite well from my experience.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a joy to have you here. Good to see you again and appreciate the great work that you're doing.